You are all here to be a part of the home and community-based settings final rule presentation on rights restrictions, because that's what we're talking about today. So I first wanted to provide kind of an overview of what the settings rule is broadly. We know for some people in our system, this might be a very familiar term. However, for other people in our system, this might not be something that you have a lot of knowledge about. So just providing that overview. Final rule was released by CMS, which is the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, in January of 2014. So this was a sweeping legislation by the federal government that applied to all individuals receiving home and community-based services to ensure that they have full access to the benefits of community living and the opportunity to receive supports in the most integrated settings appropriate. So there was a lot of thought and feedback that went into this authority. Part of the reason being, as we saw a large shift in the DD system of moving people out of institutions into the community, what we started to learn is that people, while their home or their setting might now be located more in the community, they weren't being afforded the same access and rights. And so essentially some of the settings across the country, while people were moving out of institutions, they were receiving very similar supports to what it would have been like had they been institutionalized. So the federal government, hearing feedback from participants and families and noticing this trend, decided to implement this authority. Ultimately, the goal being to enhance the quality of home and community-based services and provide protections to the participants that are receiving these services. So some of the highlights of the final rule is that there are specific requirements for the settings. So when I'm using the word settings, I'm talking about the physical locations where services are being delivered. So that's going to include group homes, supervised apartments. That's also going to include day services and employment-related service locations. So the term setting is referring to the physical building or location where certain home and community-based services are being delivered. And so the final rule requires certain things within settings. So the setting has to be integrated in and support full access to the greater community. It has to be selected by the individual from among giving them a choice of setting options. It has to ensure that the individual has a right of privacy, dignity, and respect, and is free from coercion and restraint. The setting has to optimize autonomy and independence in making life choices and facilitate choice regarding the services that they receive and who is providing them. In addition, there are the requirement that the individual has to have a lease or another legally enforceable agreement that provides similar protections to a lease. The landlord-tenant laws in the state of South Dakota are defined in codified law, so there are specific agreements or requirements that have to be in a lease. The individual has to have privacy in their unit, and that would include a lockable door, having a choice of roommates, and the freedom to decorate their unit or bedroom appropriately. They should have control of their schedules and have access to food at any time. And the individual should be able to have visitors at any time. And the physical setting itself must be accessible to the participant that's receiving services there. So what the common language that we'll use related to a residential setting is a setting that is provider owned or controlled. So provider owned or controlled settings are subject to additional requirements within our system. And so what we consider a provider owned or controlled setting is when the setting in which the individual resides in is a specific physical location that is either owned, co-owned, or operated by a provider of home and community-based services. So in South Dakota, that would include all of our level 1 and level 2 residential settings, as well as our day setting locations. And again, employment being included within day settings. Those are what we would qualify as provider-owned or controlled settings. There are certain settings that are excluded from the final rule that was issued by CMS. And so when a setting is excluded, ultimately what that means is that these settings could never deliver home and community-based services and are otherwise ineligible for home and community-based funding. So a nursing facility, an institution for mental disease, an ICF for people with intellectual disabilities, and hospitals are excluded from these requirements because somebody receiving services in these settings would be ineligible for HCBS funding. There are other locations that can have qualities of an institutional setting and be determined institution-like and also be ineligible for HCBS funding. And that is determined by the secretary being the Department of the Health and Human Services within the federal government. So all that being said, what that means is that in addition to just these kind of broad outlined categories of what is an excluded setting, a state might identify additional settings that will not meet the intent of the final rule. So to provide an example, a group home building located on the grounds of an institution would not meet the settings rule and would be ineligible for HCBS funding. There can also be additional things like if the nature or the purpose of the setting is institutional in nature, it is possible that that setting would also not be eligible for HCBS funding. The key thing to highlight, however, is that the federal regulations set the floor and not the ceiling requirements. And so states can elect to raise the standard for what constitutes an acceptable home and community-based setting. So CMS, when they released their final rule, they said that all states must do this. This is the basic level of requirements that states must enforce in order to receive HCBS funding. However, states through administrative rule or policy can add or outline additional requirements. So all states were required to submit a statewide transition plan. And what that means is that it was a plan to describe the state's process for ensuring compliance with these requirements. So South Dakota's statewide transition plan was granted final approval from CMS in August of 2019 with the expectation that all HCBS settings, and again, when I say HCBS settings, I'm talking about the physical locations, must be in compliance by March 17th of 2022. That compliance deadline was extended 1 year due to the COVID-19 pandemic to March 17th of 2023. So that means that all states have until March of 2023 to bring their physical settings where HCBS services are delivered into compliance with the federal rule. In addition to the final rule component on the physical settings where services are delivered, CMS also issued guidance in the rule about person-centered service planning. So not only were they looking at the locations, they were also looking at the process in which people are identifying their preferences, goals, and receiving supports that align with those goals. And so they outline specific requirements related to what must be included in a person-centered service plan. This plan, of course, is a way to assist people to access those supports and describe what they want and need to bring purpose and meaning into their life. So there are specific requirements that we'll go into that are required within the person-centered service planning portion of the federal authority. So The first thing is that the process has to be driven by the individual. It should include people chosen by the individual. It needs to provide necessary information and support to the individual to ensure that they can direct the process to the maximum extent possible. It has to be timely, and the meetings need to occur at times and locations that are of convenience to the individual and their family. The process must also reflect the cultural considerations of the individual receiving services, and information must be provided in plain language and in a manner that is accessible. There has to be strategies for solving conflict or disagreement within the process, and it has to include a clear conflict of interest guidelines for all planning participants. So I'm sure all of you in our system are familiar with the idea of conflict-free case management and where that came into play, and that was associated with the HCBS settings rule, which requires the separation of the provider of case management and the provider of direct supports. The planning process also has to offer choice to individuals regarding the services and supports that they receive and who they receive them from. It has to have a method for requesting updates to the plan, and it should record the alternative home and community-based settings that were considered by the individual. So again, CMS's assumption is that just because somebody has a disability and is receiving HCBS services, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have to receive those services in a disability-specific setting. The service plan also has to reflect what is important for the individual to meet their needs, but more importantly, what is important to the individual. So, of course, we have to balance health, safety, and well-being with preferences and goals for the delivery of supports. There is then guidance that the service plan, what has to be actually written into the plan. And so there are certain things that the plan must reflect. So again, it should reflect that the setting is chosen by the individual. It should talk about the individual's strengths and preferences, the clinical and support needs that are identified through an assessment of functional need. It should include individually identified goals and outcomes, and reflect the services and supports that are both paid and unpaid that will assist the individual to achieve those goals. There are additional requirements, of course. So the person-centered service plan has to reflect the risk factors and measures in place to minimize them, and should have backup plans and strategies when needed. It needs to be understandable to the individual that's receiving the services and supports, and at a minimum, be written in plain language that's easy to understand. It should identify the individual or entity responsible for monitoring the plan. It needs to be finalized and agreed upon, and include the informed consent of the individual in writing. The plan should be distributed to the individual and all people involved in the planning process. This is inappropriate within the choices waiver, but if self-direction was an option within the choices waiver, it would have to include the services that someone chooses to self-direct. And it should also prevent the provision of unnecessary and inappropriate services and supports. Oh, God. Had a feeling that was going to happen. So finally, the person-centered service planning component that we're going to really dive into today is the requirement that any modification of the protections that are afforded through the HCBS settings rule must be identified by a specific assessed need and justified in the person-centered service plan. So if you're reading the federal language, CMS uses the word modification, and I would say that that's synonymous for a restriction. I don't know why they chose the word modification. We in the state of South Dakota use the word restriction. So I just wanted to provide that clarification. And the key thing that I wanted to highlight as well is that the compliance deadline of March of 2023 is for the physical settings where services are being delivered. CMS did have an expectation that the person-centered service planning component of the federal rule was implemented as plans were renewed, which is otherwise meaning almost immediately. So again, highlighting that this rule was issued in January of 2014. The state has been working, but it is really time to make sure that we implement all of the federal requirements related to rights restrictions. So when we're talking about what is a rights restriction is a limitation to a participant's autonomy due to a specific assessed need, but primarily to ensure the health, safety, and well-being of the participant or the community. So we would consider, again, any modification or restriction made to a participant's plan in the 7 key concept areas that are defined in the HCBS settings rule guide to expectations and compliance to be a rights restriction. We're going to go into each of these concept areas. The one thing that I do want to highlight is that this list is not all, it doesn't cover every possible rights restriction. And there are always going to be individual specific scenarios. This is providing a broad overview of the protections that are afforded in the federal authority. Again, kind of what we like to use as a standard is what rights am I afforded? Is the broader community afforded? And those rights must also be afforded to the participants that are receiving our services. So the first concept area we're going to talk through is location. So participants must be given the choice to choose where to live and receive their services. They must have the same access to the broader community as non-Medicaid funded individuals. The first thing that I want to highlight is that limitations on alone time are considered restrictive. We at DDD do acknowledge that we have an administrative rule related to alone time that can somewhat be, that can be a little bit misleading and somewhat contradictory to the federal authority related to this topic. And so we will be working to make revisions to that administrative rule. But I do want to, set the tone and get it out there that we would consider somebody who is limited or always has to have staff supervision and is not able to go out into the community independently as a restrictive method. The next thing related to location is that participants can have visitors of their choosing at any time. And that would include in a residential setting, that would include overnight visitors as well. When it comes to living arrangements, again, all participants have to have a legally enforceable agreement and have the same responsibilities and protections as South Dakota's landlord-tenant laws. They must be provided with keys or access codes to the building, and they cannot or should not have a curfew and can come and go at any time. So if somebody were to have a curfew, that would be considered a restriction. In addition, within the living arrangements concept area, participants should be able to furnish and decorate their living spaces, and all participants must have access to a variety of foods throughout the day. That includes eating when they want, eating in their room or in their apartment, and the ability to keep foods or snacks in their room. When it comes to privacy, all participants' bedrooms and apartment units must have entrance doors that are lockable by the participant, with only the appropriate staff having keys to those doors. Participants that are sharing bedrooms or apartments must have a choice of roommates. So we shouldn't be putting people with a roommate simply based out of convenience. The participant's preference has to be included in that decision. Participants must have privacy to complete activities of daily living. So if somebody does have a roommate, for example, they need to be able to change in their room or do other activities of daily living privately without the presence of their roommate at the time. Health-related information needs to be kept private. So obviously, when it just comes to conversations, health-related information shouldn't be shared with family members that don't have the right to know that information or aren't the participant's guardian. In addition, individual schedules or related to diets and those types of things should be kept private and not visible to other people in the setting. And communication with family and friends should be kept private as well. Concept area 4 covers dignity and respect, in that all participants will be treated with dignity and respect and be free from coercion and restraint. They will be supported to make an informed choice, and they will be informed of how to request a new provider or change services if they're unhappy with the services and supports that they are receiving. There is also the concept area related to physical accessibility within the setting. So all participants must have access to large and small appliances, and they must be able to move freely around the setting and have reasonable, unrestricted access. Concept area 6 is related to autonomy. So participants should not be required to adhere to a set schedule for waking, sleeping, bathing, or participating in activities. They should be empowered to make decisions, and their choices should be incorporated into the services and supports that they receive. The final concept area is related to community integration. So all participants must have access to information and resources about outside activities and community events. So that doesn't necessarily mean activities and events that are being held by the community support provider or by other disability specific organizations. This would include activities and community events available to the broader community as well. And all participants must have access to their funds or other personal resources. So the CSP management of personal finances would be considered a rights restriction. I would again highlight that we acknowledge that we have an administrative rule that does not align directly with the federal authority. And again, our administrative rules can't contradict federal authority, so we'll be working to make an update to that administrative rule as well. I do want to highlight that we are talking specifically about the management of personal finances here, and we are not talking about representative payee-ship. So we're just talking about management of personal finances. And then the final requirement within community integration is that all participants are able to work and volunteer as they choose. So after going through those kind of broad categories on what can be a rights restriction, we're going to discuss when a rights restriction can be implemented. So if there are concerns for a participant's health or well-being, the ISP team must consider the severity and the likelihood of the potential negative outcomes against the rights of the individual, and only when absolutely necessary would we expect a rights restriction to be implemented in accordance with the requirements outlined in the HCBS settings rule. Of course, all other less restrictive interventions must have been tried and determined unsuccessful prior to the implementation of a rights restriction. So if somebody has a health and safety risk, we must first try positive interventions and least restrictive interventions prior to implementing a rights restriction. Moving into the documentation requirements of a rights restriction. And again, this is all outlined within the HCBS settings final rule. The first requirement is that there is a specific and individualized assessed need. So there should be assessments completed to reflect a specific need and demonstrate exactly why the participant is needing their rights to be restricted. And the results from these assessments should clearly display that the severity of the behavior justifies incorporating restrictive procedures into the ISP. The next documentation requirements for a rights restriction are that the positive interventions and supports, it has to document the positive interventions and supports that were used prior to any modifications to the ISP. So this would include what has been tried prior, as well as a clear timeline of when the interventions and supports began and the duration that they were in place. The rights restrictions documentation must also include the least restrictive intervention, the least intrusive methods of meeting the need that have been tried but did not work. So that has to include clear evidence of what was tried and why it wasn't effective, as well as a timeline of when the methods began and the duration that they were in place. Each individual is unique, so each individual's plan is going to be unique, including the appropriate use of interventions. It is unlikely that a broad, sweeping rights restriction could apply to multiple participants. Every restriction in our system has to be based off of the individual that's receiving the supports and their documented needs. There's also a requirement that a clear description of the condition that is directly proportional to the specific assessed need has to be included in the documentation. So that should include a diagnosis or condition related to whatever the assessment is that's showing the need for the restriction. And I'll provide an example of this because I think this is probably the hardest one to explain. But the stated need and the description of the condition must match. There also has to be a regular collection and review of the data to measure the ongoing effectiveness of the modification. So that is something that should be established by the participants' ISP team, including what data they're going to collect and how regularly that data is going to be reviewed. It first needs to be collected as the ISP team agrees to, and the reviews must take place as scheduled and outlined within the restriction documentation. There also has to be an established and limited timeframes for periodic reviews to determine if the modification is still necessary or if it can be lifted. Again, the federal authority is outlining the baseline. South Dakota does have specific expectations depending on what the restriction is. So for a general rights restriction, that has to be reviewed annually. For highly restrictive procedures, those have to be reviewed every 6 months. But those are just the base standard. Rights restrictions should be reviewed quarterly during quarterly monitoring that's being conducted by the case manager. And so all of that needs to be outlined within the documentation. The team must also weigh the risk and success and the amount of time necessary for this. And the timeline outlined in the plan should provide guidance on when the restrictions are no longer necessary and when a restriction can be terminated. And that has to be attainable. So we cannot implement a rights restriction and simply say that this restriction is going to be in place for the rest of the person's lifetime. There always has to be a goal that a participant can work towards related to terminating a rights restriction. The next requirement is the informed consent of the individual. So it is a federal requirement that all rights restrictions receive informed consent of the individual that the restriction is being placed upon. South Dakota codified law does define informed consent in the state of South Dakota. The participant and their guardian must understand the risks and benefits and must sign or formally acknowledge their informed consent. This is, I think, a key area when it comes to individuals either alone or those that have guardians. So there are certain there's certain authority that guardians are afforded through the courts and certain decisions that they are allowed to make. But simply a guardian making a statement on who an individual hangs out with, what type of beverages an individual drinks, though that direction alone from a guardian is not enough to implement a rights restriction. So if a guardian says that they don't want the participant hanging out with a specific friend because they don't like that friend, that alone is not justification to implement a rights restriction. First, the court order needs to be consulted to review the decision-making authority that a guardian has. Typically, it's related to medical-based decisions and those types of things. And then, if that is a directive that is being given, all of these documentation requirements also have to have been met. So if a guardian says that a participant can't drink pop because they don't like pop, but the participant doesn't have a specific and assessed need related to drinking pop, doesn't have a documented clear diagnosis or condition that is related to that assessed need, if least positive supports haven't been tried, if least restrictive interventions haven't been tried, we cannot just simply restrict an individual's ability to consume pop because that's what the guardian wants. We are going to work on some guardian-focused informational materials related to the HCBS settings rule and rights restrictions and what they mean and what the federal authority is related to rights restrictions as some kind of informational materials, because we do think that's a key component when it comes to rights restrictions. But all of these things are a team decision. There is certain documentation requirements and steps that have to be taken prior to the restriction of rights. And the last documentation requirement for a rights restriction is that the assurance that interventions and supports will cause no harm to the individual. So there has to be documentation that states that the participant would be free of physical harm, psychological harm, social risk, or seclusion. So moving into a specific example of what a rights restriction would look like in accordance with this federal authority, what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable. I'm going to walk through those 8 areas that I had outlined in the previous slides and provide a concrete example of what that might look like. So we're first going to start with the restriction alone. So Sam's doctor has approved 1 alcoholic beverage a month. That would not be an acceptable restriction. What we could say is that Sam can have 1 alcoholic drink within a 48-hour period. So walking through the first documentation requirement, which would be the specific and individualized assessed need, what wouldn't be acceptable here is to say doctor's orders. What would be an acceptable example is to note that Sam has a history of drinking in excess. And the reason why this is becoming a problem is because Sam takes a medication that doesn't interact well with alcohol. And because of his drinking, he has been to the emergency room 6 times recently due to the interactions between his medication and his alcohol. So the doctor is recommending that Sam limits his alcohol consumption. What I want to highlight here is that doctor's orders alone is not sufficient documentation or enough to implement a rights restriction. We all go to the doctor, and I can personally speak that a doctor has recommended something to me that I haven't necessarily followed, because I have the right to make that choice and make a choice for what is best for me. And that's the same for the participants that are receiving our services. Some of our participants might need additional supports to make informed choices, as well as be provided with additional guidance as to why a doctor is making that recommendation. But we still have to afford individuals with the choice to make a decision. So an example being is simply because somebody is overweight and the doctor orders them to go on a diet, that alone wouldn't be sufficient to implement a rights restriction. We would also have to see the documentation of a specific and individualized assessed need, positive interventions and supports used prior, least restrictive options, and a clear description of the condition. So, in related to Sam's restriction on alcoholic drinks within a 48-hour period, again, positive interventions and supports used prior, we wouldn't simply say none, where it's implemented upon doctor's orders because he's on a new medication. What would be acceptable is that each time that Sam chooses to not drink alcohol instead consumes a different beverage, staff would reward him with a reinforcement through praises and a high five. Staff tried this for 5 weeks after his appointment and saw little success. So prior to implementing the restriction, after Sam had his appointment with his doctor and they discussed his alcohol consumption, staff tried this positive intervention, and ultimately it wasn't successful. Moving on to less intrusive methods that have been tried but did not work. Again, we can't simply say none, but the staff working with Sam noticed certain behaviors when he wants to have a drink. So when they acknowledged those behaviors, they tried offering him 2 different canned carbonated beverages in attempt to satisfy him. So they're working with Sam. Sam's looking like he wants to open a beer. They say, hey, Sam, why don't you try this pop? Sam's not interested. So the staff tried that, and after his appointment, they saw little success as well. There has to be a clear description of the condition. So what would be acceptable documentation would be that Sam's alcohol consumption was not an issue prior to the addition of new medication that had interactions with alcohol. The doctor and the staff educated Sam on the risks associated with his medication and alcohol, and the staff had documented the number of beverages that Sam consumed. So, working with Sam through an informed decision-making process, staff worked with Sam through that process when he was contemplating if he should or shouldn't drink. So when Sam was going to have a drink, staff tried to say, hey, Sam, you remember we had this conversation with your doctor. They said that, drinking isn't good for you because you're on this medication. Why don't you try something else? And the attempts that staff had with Sam were unsuccessful. And so Sam continued to drink, resulting in him being admitted to the emergency room. Related to a regular collection of review and data to measure the effectiveness, again, not acceptable would be something like document any medical intervention required. What we would expect to see with the documentation would be each time Sam is consuming alcohol, as well as any observed symptoms or any medical attention required, each time Sam contemplates drinking, and when staff has to implement a restriction versus when Sam chooses to only drink within limits. So within the established timeframes to determine if the modification is still necessary, again, annually is obviously required within administrative rule. But at a minimum, it will be reviewed annually. But the data should be reviewed on an ongoing basis to see how Sam is doing with this restriction, because ultimately we would expect that annually, if the restriction is no longer necessary, we would have known that by reviewing the data over time. It will also outline an example of when the restriction can be terminated. So in this situation, the restriction can be terminated if Sam stops taking this medication, or when Sam demonstrates that he is able to choose, that can be with or without staff support, to not exceed the limit of drinking that was outlined in his restriction. Of course, it has to have informed consent of the individual, as well as outlined in the choices waiver. All rights restrictions have to be reviewed and approved by the individual's case manager. So what we would see as acceptable documentation would be informed consent of the individual, or their guardian, if applicable, the case manager's signature, as well as the review of the Human Rights Committee. And this can be included within that signature piece, but there has to be an assurance that the intervention and supports will cause no harm. So this is just an example of a statement in that the following ISP team and committee members approve the documented restriction. It's the least restrictive intervention identified to ensure the health and safety, and that the intervention will cause no harm to the individual or others. So this is just an example of a statement that could be used. So moving into when a restriction cannot be implemented, restrictions can't be used to impose preferences, opinions, or values of the ISP team or the staff, particularly if there's no real immediate risk to the participant's health or safety. Restrictions can only be implemented for the individual who needs the restriction and cannot be implemented for a group of individuals or for an entire setting. So every restriction has to be individualized and outlined in each individual's ISP. So if somebody that is residing in a setting has issues with food and ultimately has a restriction on access to food, other participants in the setting must be able to access food at their own free will. That doesn't mean with support of staff. That means at their own free will, they must be able to access food. The same thing could be with doors. If one participant has a restriction related to alone time due to elopement concerns, we can't lock the doors on the whole setting, preventing all participants from being able to leave, and only being able to leave if they ask staff for support. Participants should be able to come and go as they please. Restrictions cannot be used as house rules in any setting as well, and they cannot be used for the convenience of staff. So house rules are intended to be an agreement between participants in a setting based off of the fact that they're sharing a home, they're roommates. However, house rules are for the roommates who live in the house. So they might decide on a house rule. One of the roommates might not follow that rule. That's a house rule, and roommates should come together and have a conversation about that. But house rules are not intended to be implemented as a restriction or intended to be governed by providers. They're an agreement between roommates. Talking about restrictions versus supports, an example of a support would be that Sam was told by his doctor that it would be good for him to lose weight because he has diabetes. So when Sam decides what to eat for dinner, his staff guide him through what healthy options are available. Ultimately, Sam is able to choose what he wants to have for dinner, even if it's high in calories or it's something that's bad for him. But staff are supporting Sam to make good decisions. Ultimately, it's still his choice. An example of a restriction would be that Sam was told by his doctor that it would be good for him to lose weight because he has diabetes. So staff write a specific meal plan, and Sam must follow and limit his access to, and staff limit his access to snacks. That is a restriction. So another example of a restriction versus a support is that Sam had previously had people who were taking advantage of him on social media. So through a team discussion, he decides that if he has a new friend request on Facebook, he will discuss it with staff if they think that he should approve or deny that friend request. After consulting with staff, Sam still ultimately decides if he's going to add the individual or not. Whereas on the flip side, a restriction would be that Sam has previously had people taking advantage of him, so he is required to have staff check his iPad 3 times a day to review any new friends that he has added, and that staff will delete any friends that they feel Sam does not know. One of those situations is a support, the other situation is a restriction. The next thing that I want to highlight is reinforcements, because sometimes what is an individual's right to have ultimately is being used as a reinforcement. So personal property, funds, or activities that a participant has a right to engage in cannot be withheld as a form of reinforcement for a desired behavior. So if somebody likes to eat cake and they want to eat cake, we don't have the right to tell them that they only get to eat cake if they perform X desired behavior. Money that already belongs to a participant cannot also be used as a reinforcement. So we can't say, if you behave, you get X amount of dollars. That's not a reinforcement, that's a restriction. And a participant's rights cannot be restricted due to the unsuccessful completion or the refusal to participate in a program goal. The next thing I want to talk about is the emergency rights restrictions. There are going to be situations where something happens and somebody in a specific situation needs their rights to be restricted. So emergency rights restrictions can be utilized if the participant displays a behavior that endangers herself or others. All emergency rights restrictions must be in compliance with our administrative rules of South Dakota. But if after the implementation of an emergency rights restriction, the ISP team determines that this restriction is necessary and will be utilized on an ongoing basis, then the rights restrictions documentation requirements that I outlined in the steps 1 through 8 has to be met, and due process has to be afforded to the participant. So if we can't use emergency rights restrictions to circumvent the federal requirements on rights restrictions, so there might be a time when it's necessary, but if it's something that is occurring on an ongoing basis, that is a rights restriction and it must be documented in the steps outlined previously. So talking through the rights restriction process, prior to the implementation of a rights restriction, the ISP team will meet to discuss the need for the restriction. The ISP team will ensure that all documentation requirements are met. Again, those are the 1 through 8 steps that I had outlined previously. After that is done, then the Human Rights Committee should review the restriction in accordance with ARSD. Ultimately, as outlined in the choices waiver, the case manager is responsible to review and approve each restriction prior to implementation. Restrictions will be documented within the risk section of the ISP and FAIR app. Because we don't have the ability to make sure that all of the required documentation requirements outlined in 1 through 8 currently fit within the risk section as it presents in FAIR app, we will allow for documentation to be uploaded as an attachment to the risk section within the ISP. However, that documentation must include the requirements 1 through 8, and that would include the signature of the case manager and the participant or guardian providing informed consent and ensuring that this restriction will cause no harm. So because we can't get all of those fields currently in the risk section within TheraP, we will allow supplemental documentation to be uploaded as an attachment to the ISP in the risk section. So outlining the roles and responsibilities for restrictions, not going to go into this in too much detail because this is included in the roles and responsibilities document. But of course, there are the responsibilities of the case manager to facilitate the discussion, to review rights restrictions and the restoration process. The documentation in the ISP would be the requirement of the case manager. Again, the case manager is responsible for reviewing and approving rights restrictions prior to implementation. The case manager can serve as an advocate for individuals in relation to the Human Rights Committee and Behavior Support Committees, and can assist a participant to appeal a rights restriction through the CSP grievance process. The community support provider would be responsible for conducting assessments related to what is determined by the ISP team to demonstrate a specific and individualized need, review those positive interventions supports that were previously tried but didn't work, talk about the plan to restore rights and the regular collection of data, obtain that consent, and present the plan to the case manager for review and approval. And of course, human rights committees and behavior support committees are housed within the community support providers. So that would be a responsibility of the community support provider. Highlighting highly restrictive procedures. So again, CMS sets the basic standards and states can elect to implement additional administrative requirements. The state of South Dakota does have additional administrative requirements related to what we have outlined as highly restrictive procedures. So that would include a physical, chemical, mechanical restraint, or timeout, or other techniques with similar degrees of restriction and intrusion. The ISP team would also be required to review and approve these highly restrictive procedures prior to the Human Rights and Behavior Support Committee. As I know Jamie went through in the training earlier this week, the use of highly restrictive procedures requires a behavior support plan. The highly restrictive procedure processes are required to be reviewed by the Human Rights Committee and the Behavior Support Committee every 6 months. But the documentation requirements for rights restrictions are also applicable for highly restrictive procedures. The only difference is that highly restrictive procedures require that additional layer of review by the committees, as well as they're required to have a behavior support plan associated with them. We are working on distributing guidance related to chemical, or pardon me, well, yes, it is related to chemical restraint and medications. And so we are working to get that out to our provider system. It's a flow chart similar to the rights decision tree process to outline when something is identified as a chemical restraint versus a psychoactive medication and what the documentation requirements are for that. So all of that being said, we will move into the questions portion.
Jay's, there's one in the chat. When a person is only receiving CFCM services, not affiliated with the CSP, and the CM is aware that family is imposing restrictions in the home, what would due process look like in those situations? Is it needed?
Yeah, that is a good question. How it is outlined in our statewide transition plan is that we are looking at the physical settings that are what are considered provider owned or controlled. We outlined to CMS that ultimately we expect that there are decisions that are made within family homes. If any services and supports that are receiving HCBS funding should not be restrictive and would be subject to these requirements that we've outlined. What if there is something that's happening within the family home? What I would say, there might be some things that our authority does kick in. So if we're talking about certain medications or those types of things, but if there are things that are happening in a family home, it's certainly the role and the responsibility of the case manager to advocate on behalf of the participant, to engage in conversations with the family about the participant's preferences and goals. All of those person-centered plans are person-centered service planning requirements are still applicable if somebody is living in their own home. And of course, if there is a situation that rises to the level that is concerning about a participant's rights and their health and well-being, then a report should be made to Adult Protective Services.
Okay, I skipped a question. There's another one. Does the ISP signature page constitute informed consent by the individual guardian and the CFCM? Or does there need to be a specific HRC consent to include participant and or guardian and CFCM?
There would need to be a specific consent form related to rights restrictions, because rights restrictions could be implemented after an annual ISP or meeting was conducted.
Okay. Can a conservator set the amount of money a person receives? Okay, can a conservator set the amount of money a person receives from their personal finances?
I probably would have to consult with our legal, DHS legal, to address that, just because I don't want to misspeak. But Casey, if you wanted to leave your email in the chat box, I could certainly get back to you on that.
Okay, is it required for CFCMs to be present at HRC due process meetings?
We did not outline in the roles and responsibilities that it is necessarily a requirement. However, if the participant is requesting that their case manager be present at those meetings, CSP should accommodate that request.
Okay. In regards to the documentation requirements, since this is a new guidance, do CMs need to go back and complete this for RRs that are already in place? Rights restrictions, sorry, that are already in place, or can we just complete them as the rights restrictions come up for review or at annual ISPs?
That is a very good question. We have a work group meeting scheduled with the HCBS settings work group in a few weeks in November, where we are going to discuss I would say somewhat of a transition plan when it comes to rights restrictions in our system, and what our an appropriate timeline is for our system to bring current rights restrictions into compliance. So we are going to discuss that with the work group. The state is also working to make revisions to SMART so that our SMART system will reflect the federal authority related to rights restrictions.
Okay. Is there a recommendation for those situations where a house-wide restriction is currently being used to ensure the health, safety, welfare of one person supported as part of their approved plan? Specifically thinking of those homes where a fridge or pantry lock is being used and other supported in the home whose restrictions do not have the skills ability to utilize a key code.
So if a rights restriction on one individual is impacting the rights of another individual, all efforts have to be made and a solution has to be come up with for that individual or all of the individuals who aren't affected by that rights restriction to circumvent that restriction. So there has to be a way for them to navigate around it. And that way can't be a reliance on asking staff for support. So if a key code or a key code isn't possible, I would have to say that there might be other technologies available that I'm not sure. I don't know. I probably wouldn't be able to kind of get down to the details and come up with a solution right now. But what I would say is that there has to be a way for the individual who is not impacted by the restriction to circumvent the restriction.
Okay. With the implementation of the HCBS rules setting, we are going to have new rights restrictions, such as people that have no cognitive ability to manage their own money or live in an environment that can't access a washer dryer in the basement but are physically unable to do their laundry. How are restoration plans should be written?
So when it comes to something like people not being able to access their own money, ultimately, we first have to acknowledge that there might be, due to a diagnosis and a clear description of an individualized need, there is a possibility that somebody might always need kind of such a support, I guess I would say. And so what the restoration plan would expect would be to have clear and outlined steps of what might be possible for somebody to be able to retain their rights. I realize that in certain situations, that's going to look a little bit more difficult than others. There might be certain situations where a restoration plan is being utilized kind of like in a step down process. So if somebody has Prader-Willi as an example and has an obsession with food, maybe the restoration plan is taking steps. And so the next step would be to utilize technology as an example to assist with that person's eating behaviors. And if they're successful in the plan as it's written, they can take that next step. Ultimately, somebody with Prader-Willi might always have to have limited access to food because of their diagnosis. So I try to share that as an example, just to see how that might work in a similar situation. When it comes to the managing of finances, I think we're going to have to work through those situations collectively, and whether we talk through that as an example with the HCBS settings work group to come up with some type of process that is in accordance with the federal authority while also meeting the needs of the participant. When it comes to like accessing the washer and dryer as an example, and it being people are physically unable, again, is that setting maybe the most appropriate? Again, understanding that this person has physical limitations, but are there physical limitations preventing them from doing laundry because of the way the setting is, or is it something that they aspire to do and there could be modifications made, or they could move to a different setting that is accessible? So it's probably too hard in a training like this to get down to the level of detail needed to address those types of questions. And of course, we're never going to be able to provide, because these are all individualized, we're never going to be able to provide broad guidance that would apply to everybody with that condition.
Okay. Could you go over the reinforcements again? I have a couple positive behavior support plans that list snacks going into the community using their iPad as reinforcement.
Yeah, so that, I guess what I would kind of just say as a reminder is that what is somebody's right? So if somebody has a right to have snacks, which is an outlined right within the HCBS settings rule, then we can't use snacks as a reinforcement, because the federal government says that all participants have to have access to snacks at all times as they choose. When it comes to kind of maybe talking through specifics on the behavior support plans that you have listed, I think it would probably be better, and I'm going to volunteer Jamie and myself to maybe talk through some of that offline, because I see that we have maybe quite a few questions to get through, and I would be happy to provide technical assistance to anybody, but I don't want to get too caught up in the details when it comes to this training, so I can hopefully answer more questions. But what I would say is that what is outlined as a right for somebody cannot be used as a reinforcement.
Okay. In regards to informed consent, does this mean the person needs to agree with the restriction being imposed If so, and the person disagrees, how does the team address?
Yes, so this is probably one of the hardest conversations to have, but informed consent is a requirement for all restrictions. What comes along with informed consent is the participant knowing what is or isn't going to happen if this restriction is implemented. So participants have to understand that if this restriction, if it meets all of the documentation requirements, has to be implemented to ensure their health, safety, and well-being, and that the provider needs to implement this restriction to keep them safe, to keep the community safe. And without this restriction, they might risk losing services. That has to be a part of a conversation. That's a part of informed consent. If somebody has to know what the ramifications of their decision does or doesn't mean. And so engaging in that conversation with an individual. But the one thing that I will preface and that you might be picking up on is that this is a very comprehensive process, and it was designed that way so that rights restrictions became a thing of last resort. That was the intent of this federal authority. So that's what it's aiming to get at, is that these restrictions require a lot of documentation. It requires a pretty extensive process. And the reason being is that what we need to move our focus away from restrictions and try to focus more on supports for individuals and allow them dignity of risk to make choices, mistakes, decisions. But ultimately, when it comes to informed consent, is people have to be aware of what the ramifications of their decision might be if they choose to not have a restriction implemented.
Thank you. It was mentioned that the HCBS settings rule is the floor, not the ceiling. Does the state of South Dakota currently have any requirements that are above what the federal requirement is? If there are any requirements, sorry, I moved my thing. If there are any requirements above what the federal mandate is, how will this be communicated to the CSPs?
Sure. The only requirements that that state has that are above the federal requirements are our administrative rules on human rights committees, behavior support committees, the codified law related to behavior support plans, and the like reviewing requirements of highly restrictive procedures. So none of those administrative rules are new things to the system. Those should be things that our system is familiar with and that we're already doing. I would say the only really new part which is why we're having this training, is what the federal authority says. And so what we're trying to do is meld federal authority with our pre-existing state authority.
Okay. There seems to be a gray area sometimes when CSPs will change a restriction to a support, yet it is still restrictive. An example would be with 24/7 staff supervision for someone with dementia. What are your thoughts? Mostly I question it because there isn't a way to write a restoration plan.
Sure. So we can't label something as support that is a restriction. So alone time, not having alone time, or the ability to be in a room, to be in your community, CMS would consider to be a restriction. Again, if somebody that has dementia and it's at risk for their health, safety, and well-being by going out into the community alone, that can be justified through a rights restriction. What that might look like in terms of a restoration plan is, are there step-by-step processes? And again, ultimately, it's going to depend on the individual and the situation, and if they're able to ultimately meet what's outlined in the restoration plan, but that has to be continued in a conversation. So maybe if somebody doesn't have any alone time, the first step is that person being able to sit out in the garden by themselves. And maybe their a least restrictive option is some type of alert system that would notify staff if the person leaves the garden. So you can build in supports into a restriction that would be considered a restoration plan because it's giving the participant active steps to take towards not having a restriction any longer.
Okay, Jace, I think I got all the questions in the chat, so I'm not sure if anyone else has a question.
The only thing that I would want to highlight that I didn't include in this presentation is that we did distribute guidance documents related to rights restrictions, the updated decision tree, as well as the updated settings expectations guide to compliance. We will continue to work with the HCBS settings work group related to what I would say is somewhat of a systemic change in handling rights restrictions, and come up with kind of a transition period, and we will communicate that to the entire system.
A new question. Oh, hold on, 2 new questions. The current rights and restrictions decision tree says, has the person been provided education, exposure, and experience? If so, no rights restriction. Can you talk about this a little bit?
Yes, that is not the current decision tree. DDD issued a new decision tree that is accordance with the federal authority, and that was distributed. I don't have the exact date on it, but it was a few months ago.
Okay. Do you see the other one then?
Yeah, thank you. So the first guidance question is a limitation being imposed beyond what someone without a disability would experience. Someone with dementia without a disability would be safeguarded. I would say that yes, they would be safeguarded, but you know, speaking from personal family experience, my husband's grandma has dementia. She lives in a home with her husband in the community, and she is afforded unsupervised time. So she can go and get the mail by herself, as an example. She can spend time in the garden by herself. She doesn't have to have, she can spend time in her bedroom by herself. She doesn't have to have somebody with her 24/7.
Okay. Are bed checks rights restrictions?
I mean, is that, I guess I would probably need more information. Is that just staff checking to see if somebody needs anything? Is that staff checking to make sure that somebody hasn't left? Is that, I would probably need a little bit more information.
Okay.
With the next question, sorry, should we hold off on updating plans until we get more guidance / see the decision tree? I think that ultimately what I would say in terms of updating plans is if you have individuals whose rights restrictions are going to be reviewed soon, you should probably start walking through the process, getting familiar with the authorities. And again, we have released the rights decision tree. Those should be available on the provider portal, as well as the guide to expectations and compliance and the rights guidance document. What we will issue more guidance on coming forward is kind of all rights restrictions have to be updated by X date.
So back to the bed check, what would you make a bed check? What would make a bed check a rights restriction?
So I'm probably not going to be able to cover anything, but I would say kind of what I was listing off is a bed check being completed to make sure that somebody's still in their bed, that they haven't left. Is it being used to make sure that somebody is in their bed by a certain time? Is it being used to make sure that somebody is sleeping as opposed to doing what they would otherwise prefer to be doing, messing around on their phone, being on their computer? So those could be some examples of a bed check being restrictive.
We have a ton, probably majority of people that need staff in the community with them, mostly for supportive reasons, but also for safety reasons, do all these people have to have a rights restriction?
Yeah, if somebody is unable, if they are prevented from going out into the community alone, that would be considered a rights restriction.
Okay, so for a person who does not give informed consent, can they still have a rights restriction if it affects people's health, safety, welfare? Example, if it would affect the community safety.
And no, so rights restrictions cannot be implemented without informed consent.
Will there be an updated assessments that CMs will use to assess all of these areas at ISP time?
Yes, we are working on a case manager assessment for rights restrictions that would address not the physical setting, but an individual's specific rights. And that will be the case manager's responsibility to conduct that assessment. We were working on it, and then we felt like we wanted to focus on the settings themselves, because that is a really important requirement of the federal rule, because if we don't get our settings into compliance by March of 2023, we will lose funding. And then we wanted to have this training related to rights restrictions broadly before we worked on implementing a case manager driven rights assessment.
Okay, as of now, that's all I have in the chat.
I do have my, so I'll go and then I'll look at the questions again. I do have my contact information here. So if you have specific questions, if you would like very specific technical assistance related to an individual situation, you can certainly contact me at any time. If a person is an individual adult and does not go into the meeting without staff, it does not agree to the situation. And now let that person just go in the community. So I think, okay, and then the next question is, if the person does not consent to restriction, we cannot restrict, therefore how will we ensure safety? So just kind of highlighting that the federal rule, the HCBS final rule, does require informed consent for all restrictions. So that would include alone time and going out into the community.
Okay, so there's about 6 minutes left. Are there any other questions? Oh, did you see that one? Roles and responsibilities. Okay.
Oh, sorry. Roles and responsibilities says that CSPs conduct the assessment, not the CMs. Am I misunderstanding this? Within the roles and responsibilities document, the CSP is responsible for conducting an assessment to demonstrate a specific and individualized need. The assessment that we're talking about, the case managers completing, would be like just a broad rights assessment. So the case manager annually would be checking in with the participant in the ISP team to make sure that an individual's rights aren't being restricted without having gone through this process.
And the next question, when will this PowerPoint recording be available on the portal? I had said hopefully by the beginning of next week. Do you have anything different on that?
No, that sounds hopeful.
Okay, any last questions? From what I understood, page 2 of the decision tree lays out the 8 documentation requirements.
Correct.
Okay.
Other rights assessment to be done by the CM to be available. That we would hope, I would say, could be used at the, we would hope that it would kind of come out similar to when we will issue additional guidance on bringing all rights restrictions into compliance. So we'll know more after we meet with the HCBS settings work group on that. Oh, and Marta, you've been using the tree to facilitate discussion. That's great. Can someone answer my question before we go? I thought that I did, which is that if informed consent is not provided to a rights restriction, then a rights restriction cannot be implemented. All righty, I'm not seeing any more. If a person supported did not agree with the restriction, but the guardian does, can the restriction be implemented then? If a person has a guardian and the restriction is within the guardian's decision-making authority, then yes, a restriction can be implemented. As long as documentation requirements have been met as well. Yes, we can also upload a copy of the presentation not attached to the recording to the portal.
Do you see that question, Jay?
Yes. Okay, there's a couple were coming through. So the signature requirements, I think, I'm not going to try to scroll all the way back there. I can, okay, I'm just going to do it. So this is just an example. Oh, I'm on the wrong one. Oh, I went too far. Okay, this is just an example of and I can certainly kind of clarify that example prior to posting the PowerPoint to the presentation to the portal. But this will be an example if the guardian consent is applicable. So I can try to make that more clear, I guess.
If a person needs full assistance moving about the community by staff, needs a wheelchair, would that be a rights restriction?
So without knowing, again, some of the specifics about documentation requirements 1 through 8 and the specific individualized assessed need, as well as the documentation of the condition, I probably wouldn't be able to get into too much of the specifics, but the expectation would be that all participants have access to the community and the ability to come and go as they please. So I'd be happy to talk through what that might look for. I think it's probably clear that we need to get some additional guidance related to situations where individuals have more extreme limitations. And then the last question is person's signature is not applicable if the guardian has authority. That's correct.
Okay, so it's 11:30. Jays?
Yes. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today. Again, I am always available as well as your assigned DDD program specialist. So please reach out if you have additional questions.